This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is February 27th, and it's just me, producer Pat. Darren is on his way back to Canada, but Adam is on his way out of the country. Maybe they'll see each other at the airport. Today on the show, Christina and I had a chat with Stuart Farrimond. Specializing in food science, Dr. Stuart Farrimond is a former medical doctor turned science and medical writer, presenter, and educator. He makes regular appearances on British TV, on radio, and at public events, and his writing appears in national and international publications like The Independent, The Daily Mail, and New Scientist. He is the author of a book, Science of Cooking, Every Question Answered to Perfect Your Cooking, and his brand new book is called Spice, Understanding the Science of Spice, Creating Exciting New Blends, and Revolutionizing Your Cooking. Both published by DK Books. Now, if you've heard Stuart on the show before, you know that he is quite the character and a blast to talk to. Originally scheduled for a half hour, we talked with him for an hour and a half and still had to cut some of the questions we had planned to ask him. Needless to say, we'll have him on the show again soon. I hope you enjoy our conversation with the one and only Stu Farrimond. Welcome back to The Reality Check, Dr. Stuart Farrimond.
It's a pleasure to be with you guys again.
Sir, we have so many questions for you today, but maybe first you could tell us a little bit about yourself. How is it that a medical doctor changes paths and decides to become a science educator specializing in, of all things, food science?
Yes, a very strange and windy road that has led me to this place. The story is not particularly jolly one. I was originally working as a medical doctor, what is now 12 years ago. And at the time I was working in a hospital doing general kind of hospital medicine jobs. And I was diagnosed at that time with a brain tumor or a brain cancer, which meant that I had to have surgery to have the tumor removed. It's a malignancy, it's a cancer. So it's not a curative thing, but a very slow growing kind of tumor called a glioma. It was removed and I tried going back to work, but the surgery left me with epilepsy. So I wasn't able, I tried going back to work, but I suffered a lot with fatigue and I was having seizures. Wow. And so it wasn't going to work. So that's what forced me to step out from medicine. I had to step down from that. And I then took I think it was about 12 months or something to get into teaching. I kind of went into a teaching job, a lecturing job for 16 to 19-year-olds doing a health and social care study course, which is generally for 16-year-olds who don't like conventional school and they want to do a more kind of a vocational course. And this was, of course, at a local college. And it was generally girls who wanted to go into nursing or midwifery or something along those kind of healthcare professional type lines. And I was tasked with the job of teaching them the boring science stuff. And this is where I fell in love with the whole science communication thing. And it dawned on me that these 16-year-olds, 16, 17, 18-year-old girls, they didn't like science at all. They thought it was boring and dull. And B, what they thought they knew about science, they didn't really know very well at all. And C, actually, by just explaining it to them in terms that they understand and that everybody can understand, they get it, because science isn't really something that's all that complicated once you get past the terminology and the jargon. And if you just take that jargon away and put it into terms people can understand, it makes sense and it's interesting, fascinating. And I kind of fell in love with it. And then from that, I fell into doing all sorts of weird things. It was television originally that got me into doing things outside of the classroom, from a very random blog article that I'd written on a board summer day working in the college when there were no students there. I was bored and decided I was going to go down in my lunch breaks to the science lab and do some silly scientific experiments on biscuit dunking or cookie dunking. biscuit dunking is a big thing for British people.
Right.
To get your biscuit and dunk it in your cup of tea when you're having your 11 o'clock tea break or whatever. And so doing a sort of a silly science thing of which biscuit is the best for dunking. So I did that, and I recorded a video of myself doing it, all very tongue-in-cheek, and it got picked up by a BBC TV production company who wanted to do some science on biscuits, and I filled in this little 5-minute slot looking very geeky in a science lab, doing experiments on cookies in pots of water. And then when you end up doing one thing on the TV or the radio, you become, I guess, a safe pair of hands, or that you've got something, you got something done. And so people come to you and they say, oh, we've got this science thing. Could you come and do this? And so I did lots of biscuits related things to begin with, and then diversified out into other things, into various sort of food science areas, and sort of built up my expertise from there. And then ended up writing books, and so here I am, all about food science. And
I think you're being a bit humble, though, Stuart. I don't think that they would have you back if you weren't good at it, right?
Well, now you say it, yes. I love it. I actually really love doing TV and media stuff, because it's a way in which you can reach it's much bigger than your classroom. Mm-hmm. You can talk to so many people. I love the radio especially, because it's just you and a microphone, and there's no real stress there. You don't have a camera staring at you and stuff like that. You don't have to care about what you look like. So I just love it. It's just really great fun. And book writing is pretty cool as well. So I'm really, really lucky with so many things. Unfortunately, the tumour is returning, is growing slowly, Adam. So in the next 2 or 3 months, I'm looking at going through a round of treatments with surgery and radiotherapy and chemotherapy.
Wow.
So that's going to be, I've done surgery before, but this is a whole new thing with radiotherapy and chemotherapy. So again, really sort of bringing everything into perspective in a very real way. So that's where I'm at. So watch this space. Who knows what the next part of the journey will be. So you've got a raft of questions for me. So
a raft of questions.
Should we try and go quick fire and see how many I can get through?
Absolutely.
Yes. So we'll condense the questions for the sake of time, but let's start with the checker named Paul. He wrote in, we've all heard that song in elementary school behind closed doors, beans, beans, the musical fruit, or beans, beans, they're good for your heart. I'm wondering exactly what's in the beans that causes gas. I've been told that if you boil them longer, it'll make them not so gassy. Is that true? If you cook beans longer, will that make them less gassy? And what is the chemical reaction that causes them to be gassy in the first place?
Yes, beans. Yes, they have a poor reputation, don't they?
Yes.
Beans, yes, I like beans. But a little bit of history for you. They were what's called the poor man's meat. And that's because in the US Great Depression, it was the cheapest, most affordable form of protein that you could get. But beans are super healthy for you. Loads of great nutrients, B vitamins, all sorts of good stuff. But they make you fart, especially if you don't have them very often. And that is because the bacteria, the bugs in our gut, specifically in the large bowel, which is the last bit of our intestines, that's where all these bugs live. There's about 1.5 kilos of bacteria that are living in our gut.
Wow,
and
that's a lot.
It's a lot. And every day they produce something in the region of about a pint of gas, so from about 700 mils of gas to up to about 1.5 litres of gas are produced every day. And it just sort of, what they're doing is that they're chewing on the things that we can't eat. So the fibre that's in our food, everything that isn't digested by the time it gets to the last part of the bowel, the large intestine, the bacteria go, ooh, is this food for me? Maybe it is. And so the fibre gets chewed by the bacteria. And as a kind of a thank you gift for the food that you've given them, they produce this lovely gas, which can be quite aromatic. So if you change your diet quite dramatically and you have loads of fiber all of a sudden, and beans are a great source of fiber, then you're going to cause an overgrowth of these bacteria. They're going to go crazy. They're going to go, wow, there's loads of this great food. And so these gas-producing bacteria will overgrow and produce all this excess gas, which will make you fart. The other thing about beans is there's a particular fiber in them that is particularly conducive to gas, called oligosaccharides. And that's a particular thing that's quite in high levels in beans. And so you can do things to reduce the gassiness of your beans if you like. Boiling them for longer won't really make much difference to the amount of oligosaccharides that are in it. But if you get your beans and you boil them and then you throw the water away, that will get rid of some of the oligosaccharides. And so that will reduce the amount of fartage that the beans will cause. The other thing is if you soak your beans, which you don't have to do. A lot of cooks say you've got to soak your beans, got to soak them overnight. Most beans, you don't have to soak. They just take a bit longer to cook. But if you do soak the beans, then you throw the water away, then that will also help reduce the gas problem that you have with your beans. The one thing that I would say about soaking beans and whether or not you shouldn't soak them is that kidney beans, you must make sure that kidney beans are cooked all the way through. So they contain a poison in them called phytohemagglutinin. And if you don't either soak them really well the night before, throw away the water, and then cook them properly, or you slow cook them, you don't get them to above 100 degrees C for a good period of time, then raw kidney beans, undercooked kidney beans can be dangerous.
Wow.
I've never heard that.
All right, Stuart, when I told Paul you were coming on the show and that we'd ask you his bean question, he sent another question about drinking water. In particular, bottled water. He wrote, the prescription for nutritional healing recommends drinking distilled water, saying once consumed, steam distilled water leaches inorganic material that have been rejected by the cells and tissues out of the body, and that only steam distilled water should be consumed. He writes that other people have told him that steam distilled water is bad for you because it has no minerals in it. And then he goes on to say, I used to try and drink distilled water as much as I could. However, my doctor told me that as long as it's from my tap and that his tap is safe, then his organs should do fine in filtering out the bad stuff in the water you drink. Since you plan on having food scientist Dr. Stuart Farrimond on the show, would you also please ask him this question?
You have asked this question. Yes, a good question. I've been trying to make sense of that instruction from the prescription for nutritional healing. It doesn't make any sense to me about steam distilled water, leaching chemicals. Essentially, there's a lot of pseudoscience surrounding water and distilling water and the right way in which you should purify your water. The bottom line is that your doctor is about right. Tap water is pretty much very safe if you live in the UK, if you live in the States, and I'm pretty sure in Canada as well. And so the stuff that comes out of your tap is perfectly fine. When it comes to distilling water, and this document says steam distilled water, that means basically you're getting the water, you're boiling it, you're collecting the steam, and then that steam, you're letting it condense into water, and then that is what you're drinking. And that's a good way of purifying water, of getting rid of most stuff from it. So you'll get rid of bacteria, you get rid of a lot of the metals that might be in it, and you'll get rid of all the salts and the minerals that are in it. So it means that the small amounts of minerals that are in the water, and there are things like calcium, magnesium, there's sodium, potassium, essentially whatever the water has flown through, whatever rocks it's filtered through on its way to eventually getting to your tap. It picks up tiny traces of these things, but they're all essentially gone if you steam distill your water. Now, this is where the controversy comes in, because some people will say that if you take all that out of the water, then you're lacking that in your diet, and so you're putting yourself at risk of having lack of minerals. In reality, the levels are so low, it makes barely any difference at all. Although on a kind of a population scale, on a worldwide basis, the World Health Organization have previously advised that it's good not to demineralize water, not to take those minerals out, because when you're talking about a whole world of people, then actually making sure people get enough minerals in their diet does make sense, and it can make very subtle differences. So there is some evidence to show that people who live in a hard water area, that's water where you know if you get kind of limescale building up on around your plug holes and your taps. That's because you've got a lot of dissolved, often calcium that's in it, that's in the water. The people who drink hard water tend to have better health outcomes than people who have softer water. There is a link with reduced rates of cardiovascular disease, so heart problems, and childhood fractures. These are all kind of quite small, marginal differences. The bottom line is that it doesn't matter a big way, one way or the other, whether you have distilled water or non-distilled water. The body is very good at coping. Generally speaking, water that has some minerals in it is probably better for you. And also it will taste okay. When you have distilled water, it generally tastes pretty rubbish. Which is why, so if you go to a store and you get a bottle of water, I know there's one brand called Smart Water, or at least over here, how it's produced is it's made from distilled water. It comes from the drinks manufacturers who probably about 10, 15 or so years ago, they were thinking, right, we've got all this equipment here that purifies water for making our soft drinks and for making our coffee. What can we do with it? We can sell water. And so using the distilled water, they bottle it up. But because it tastes so awful, they have to add some minerals back into it that they've stripped out from the distilling process just to make
Really?
it taste okay. So when you go and you get your bottle of Smart Water or whatever it is from the shop, if it's not spring water or mineral water, then it's probably distilled water that's had the minerals stripped out of it, put back in again, so it tastes okay.
Interesting.
So doesn't make a lot of difference, but I would probably say don't bother steam distilling. Really, it's probably not worth it.
So the one thing that I'll say, Stuart, is that yes, generally speaking, in Canada, we have clean water that you can drink from your tap. We do, however, have an issue with some Aboriginal communities where they do not have clean drinking water, just because people have written about it in the past, and so don't want to make that sweeping generalization.
Yeah, absolutely. Steam distilling is a fantastic way of making your water safe to drink. So if you have any sensible concerns about the water that you're drinking, then it's a good thing to do to purify it or to distill it in some way. But for most of us who have regulated tap water, there really is nothing to be worried about.
Okay, so I have an opinion about the following question from Checker Dan, but I'll read his question first. I've often heard it said that you should keep your knives sharp because a sharp knife is safer than a dull one. The explanation given is that you have to push harder with a dull knife, so you're more likely to slip. I have to say, Stuart, I'm on the dull knife is worse than a sharp knife camp. But he goes on to say he's cut himself a couple of times. It's always been with a sharp knife. He's seen others who've cut themselves, and what he usually hears is something like, I didn't realize the knife was that sharp. He's never heard anyone say, that knife was so dull I had to push too hard and it slipped. So he's just wondering if there's any data, studies, reports, or if this has just been repeated so many times that people think it's true.
Yeah, I've got to admit, I'm probably with him on the whole idea that how on earth can a dull knife cause you nasty cut injuries. And it's quite hard, as you would expect, to find any kind of data that looks at this other than the anecdotes from chefs who say it's more dangerous if you don't have a sharp knife. So the truth is that if you use a knife regularly, so you are a butcher, a chef, somebody who works in any kind of culinary area that handles a lot of knives, does a lot of cooking, A sharp knife is safe because it means you have to make fewer cuts. There's less strain on your wrist muscles and on your hands. It means that you're going to make fewer errors, and so you're less likely to injure yourself. For most of us mere mortals who don't do a lot of cooking, there isn't a lot in it. I've had a good look to try and find any kind of research that's looked at the instance of cutting injuries and the sharpness of the knife. It's very difficult to find, but I found a couple of studies, and I guess we'll put them up in the show notes. And there is a study that shows that injuries in pork processing plants are more likely to happen after the workers have sharpened their knives.
Oh.
Interesting.
So, and I kind of, I would resonate with that experience, in that sometimes if I pick up a knife and I look at it and I go, "Ooh, is that sharp?" And you can sort of foolishly feel the blade and go, "Ooh, that's a bit sharp." But the study itself doesn't try to explain it. It says it admits it can't explain why it is that there's this association. It's a very strong association between accidents after knife sharpening, because in those processing plants, the sharpeners, they're often, I believe, above head height. And so it may well be that the fact of you're having to move the knife around quite a lot to sharpen the knife, and it's the whole action of then coming back to your work area when you cut yourself, or not. We just don't know. But for home cooking situations, there has been some research done looking at how non-chefs handle knives of different materials and different sharpnesses, and they found that actually it doesn't seem to make much difference. We're all not that good with our knives, not that proficient with our knives, so we use about the same amount of force when we use our knife, whether it's sharp or whether it's blunt. And when it's really sharp, we don't really use any fewer cuts than if it was quite blunt. So it doesn't make much difference. The theory behind it is that when the cutting edge of the knife gets blunt, no longer is that very fine edge, almost like the peak on a mountain, able to cut into whatever it is you're putting into, the meat, rather than sliding in between individual cells or tearing the fibers apart and sliding down and splitting the food apart. It's rounded, the edge is rounded, so it's pushing on it, and so rather than slicing and paring apart the food, it's crushing it. And so I guess if it's really blunt, it's almost like a skier bouncing, sliding down the side rather than cutting into it. And I guess we've all had that. If you get a tomato,
yes, I was going to say tomatoes are my worst enemy with a dull knife.
It slides off the side. And this is the reason why serrated edge knives are really good for things that are smooth, like peppers, like tomatoes, like bread, where the surface is very smooth. There's very little for the edge to catch on to make that first cut in, that first incision in, so that the rest of the blade can then slide in and split it apart. But when you're using a serrated edge, each of those scalloped kind of curves, each of those is an individual, kind of like a little knife. It's a little point. And so what happens is that the movement that you make with a serrated knife is different. It's forwards and backwards rather than down. And so what happens is as you pull it towards you, the pointy downy bit catches on the smooth surface. And then once one of those points is in, the rest of the blade follows in, and you've got that first break in the surface, and the rest of the blade can slide in. So serrated knives.
Is that the technical description, the pointy downy bit?
The pointy downy. Yes, it is. You heard it here first. Yes, the pointy downy bit. The sharp bit. So yeah, there's the kind of some of the science behind your knives and your blades. In terms of when the blade goes blunt, one thing that people think that they've got in their kitchen, in their block of knives that they've been given for Christmas or a wedding presents, you've got that rod, that metal rod thing. Yeah, have you got one of those?
Yeah, for sure. It almost looks like a file.
Yeah, have you ever used it?
No.
No. Yeah, everybody's got one. Nobody's ever used it. What's it called?
I don't know.
idea.
Some people call them sharpening rods, on the mistaken belief that those rods sharpen your blade, but they do not sharpen your blade. They're actually honing rods. And what they do is they straighten out the edge of the blade. So if you can imagine zooming right in to the pointy bit of the blade, is that when you use it over time, that very thin mountain peak-like top of the blade gets bent over. And as it gets bent over, it curves over, you're essentially getting a rounded top. But if you can straighten that curved edge, like it's gone over like a wilted leaf, if you can straighten it back up again, then you got a sharp knife again. And so this is what a honing rod does, or a steel, as some people call it, is that as you scrape the knife down one side, and where it's kind of curved over, just at the very tip, that it knocks it back into line, and so then you've got a sharp pointing edge again. So
that's cool.
You're not sharpening it, you're honing it. What happens over time is that even if you use that regularly, so that you get the end as sharp as possible, the metal will wear down over time, and your honing rod won't make any difference. And at that point, you need to sharpen it. And sharpening involves actually taking away some of the metal from the cutting surface from both sides to form a new point again. And for that, you need a sharpening tool.
So, Stuart, I saw on Facebook that you will be on ITV tomorrow to talk about junk food. I also saw you post a couple hours ago that maybe it got cut and is on the cutting room floor, which is a bit of a bummer. But either way, it seems to be geo-blocked for us here in Canada. So can you give us the scoop? Why can't we resist junk food?
Yes, there is a TV show that's going to be aired tomorrow as we record, although UK listeners will be able to get it. It's on ITV, and it's called The Junk Food Experiment. I was contacted by the production crew quite a while back, 6 or 8 months ago, and they wanted to find out more about the science of junk food and why is it that junk food is so irresistible. So I did a whole load of really fun experiments. They were really good, and so I'm kind of surprised that they haven't included it. And my only conclusion is that they wanted more time on the celebrities and less time on the science, because the program is we've got a bunch of celebrities and we're going to make them just eat junk food for 3 weeks. 1 week they're just going to eat fried chicken and nothing else. The next week they're going to eat pizza and nothing else. And the next week they're going to eat burgers and nothing else. And see what happens. And they're going to keep video diaries. So it's like Super Size Me, but more selective and on different kinds of food.
Right.
So yes, we went into a sort of a kitchen lab and did some stuff trying to answer the question of why is quote unquote junk food so irresistible? What is it in burgers, pizza, fried chicken that makes it taste so good? And the answer to that is that it contains the food that we find utterly compelling. It contains fat, sugar, and salt.
And salt, yeah.
3 things that are really important for your health, or that your body craves, that will never, I have not yet found an example of those 3 things happening in the same food in nature.
Oh.
So you get sweet things, you get fruits, you can get honeys, you can get, you can get some starchy things that have, easy to digest carbohydrates in. You can get salty things. You can have like olives, and you can have fish have salt in them, and you get fat from meats and all sorts of things, but you don't get them together. And so when you put them together, your brain is going, "Oh wow, there's these things that I really like, that I need, that's going to keep me going for a long time. I must have it." And there's the fullness factor is just kind of overridden. We don't get satiated with it because it has these things in which are part of our primal wants. So that's the reason why we find these things utterly compelling. And I was exploring What is it that they do to it to make it really, really irresistible? Is there a bliss point? Is the question of getting all these things just right. And you can find out that if you add sugar to food, if you make things sweeter and sweeter and sweeter, they get nicer and nicer and nicer to a point, and then it gets sickly. If it's with a drink, it tends to be about 11% sucrose sweetness equivalent in a drink. That beyond that, it gets sickly. It's a little bit lower in adults, a little bit higher in kids. And incidentally, the sweetness of Coca-Cola happens to be right on the point, which is optimum for kids. It's the break point of sweetness enjoyment for children, which is kind of interesting. A coincidence, quite possibly.
It's the engineering of food that we crave because of sort of our evolutionary development.
Yes, absolutely. And by combining three very important things into one food, it makes it very difficult to engage those natural, I'm full now, I must stop eating, because it's, absolutely. It's a triple whammy effect. Salt, there is a limit, obviously, to how much salt we can tolerate, and too much salt is very clearly bad for you. It upsets the whole water balance in your body. But you can increase salt considerably in food. It enhances the flavor of things. If you add salt to sweet things, it makes them sweeter. It can reduce the bitterness and the unpleasant flavor elements of food. Both sugar and salt can do that. But the big one is fat. Now, whereas there's a limit to sugar and there is a limit to salt, how much you can put in before it gets unpleasant, with fat, there is no limit. You can keep adding fat and the food gets nicer and nicer and nicer. And so we did this experiment where I made the base of a really simple curry. So just fried up some onions and some garlic and some tomatoes in a frying pan, in a skillet, and with a bit of oil. And we played the game of let's add ingredients. We had some basic spices in there, and so we added a bit of butter, and it tastes a bit better. And then add a bit of sugar and a bit of salt, and that's nice. If you add too much sugar, it doesn't make it overly sweet, but it just makes the whole thing taste a bit better. And you can keep adding butter, and you can keep adding butter, and more and more. And we added to a small frying pan a whole block of butter, wow, which is, what we're talking, 250 grams or something, a whole block. And we were tasting as we went, and it tasted really good. We'd added it all. We kept going, right, let's add a bit more. It's going to be disgusting now. But then you close your eyes and you taste it. Actually, it's really creamy. That's really nice. And when you realise, actually, we got to the end, and it was this. One of the guys said, they said, you should open an Indian restaurant, because it's just like how I have it in a restaurant. And that is the trick. Yeah. The trick that makes it of restaurant quality, if you like. Well, not entirely, but the thing that can differentiate your home cooking from what you have when you go to a takeout or you go to a curry house or something like that is the amount of fat that's in it. It tastes great. It just tastes good. So we kind of showed in this really fun experiment, this is how you make food taste like junk. Keep adding fats. Make sure there's plenty of sugar and plenty of salt in there, and you'll find something that is irresistible.
Well, here in North America, Stuart, we store eggs in the fridge. And as I understand, I know you cover this in your book, many Europeans do not. Why is that? What's the distinction?
Interesting and controversial one. You wouldn't believe how opinionated people get over the most irrelevant things, like where do I keep my eggs?
That.
It's like having a political debate. People, you either on one side or the other. You either keep your eggs in the fridge or you keep them in the cupboard, and your way is right. In reality, doesn't make a lot of difference. But there is a difference in the general guidance across the Atlantic. In the States, you guys are recommended to keep eggs in the fridge, whereas in Europe, it's not in the fridge. So if I'm right, if you're going around the shop, your eggs would be in the kind of the chilled cabinet. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's in our fridge, yeah.
Whereas over here, it's just on a standard shelf. The reason behind it is, the theory behind it is that by keeping it in the fridge, you reduce the amount of bacteria that can grow in the egg, and so you reduce the chances of food poisoning, and in particular salmonella food poisoning.
Mm-hmm.
In Europe, they have the attitude of, we don't want to keep it in the fridge, because if you keep it in the fridge, condensation can grow on it, and that might encourage the growth of bacteria on the shell, which could then increase the risks of some kind of food poisoning, some kind of contamination to the food as you handle it. The difference in the way the eggs are handled is that in North America, the eggs are cleaned quite aggressively, sometimes with chemical cleaners, and that can strip off the outer cuticle layer of the shell, which can theoretically make it more vulnerable to being contaminated by bacteria getting to the inside of the egg. Whereas in the UK and the EU, they don't do that. And so the thinking is that nothing's going to get in that shell, so don't bother keeping it in the fridge, just keep it in the cupboard, it'll be fine. So that's the difference. In reality, you're talking a marginal difference, and there probably isn't much difference one way or the other. Although, generally speaking, if you want your egg to last longer, keep it in the fridge, because the colder something is, the slower all chemical reactions take place, and so the slower it will take for the egg to degrade over time, so your egg will keep longer if you keep it in the fridge. But if you do keep it in the fridge, don't keep it in the door. Do you guys have the little egg holders in fridge doors?
Yes, we do.
Yes. But we don't keep them. We don't keep eggs in the door.
No, I've yet to find the real story behind why they invented those things. But you shouldn't keep them in the fridge door. They're the worst place to keep them. One, because you're opening and closing it, it's getting banged. And so actually that's going to increase the chance that you're going to weaken the yolk, so that when you open it, when you crack it open, that your yolk's going to split. And also when it's in the door, the temperature of the egg will go up and down quite a lot, which again is not good for growth of bacteria. So don't keep it in the door, put it towards the back of the fridge where it's nice and cool, and you'll have eggs that last a good period of time.
All right, Stuart, so your new book is all about spices, and I bought it for Christina for Christmas. So tell me, what is a spice, and why do some spices work well together while others not so much?
Okay, what is a spice? It sounds a simple question, but it's more complex than you might expect, like many things that are on this show. A spice, though, the best definition I have come up with, a spice is any parts of a plant that is used in small quantities for flavoring that doesn't come from the leaf. Okay, so roots, bark, seeds, sap, any part of the plant that is highly potent in flavor, that you would typically dry. So a spice is typically amenable to drying, whereas anything that is from the leaf you would call a herb or an herb. So leaves are herbs, the rest of the plant is a spice. There are some caveats. So some leaves can kind of fall into both camps. So bay leaves and curry leaves, they're very thick, hardy leaves that actually benefit from being dried. And so for that reason, they're often considered to be a spice or a spice leaf rather than a herb. And you cook the two differently. So herbs, you will add them typically towards the end of cooking. They're more delicate. They don't hold on to their flavor as well. And they don't stand up to drying very well, generally speaking. Why do spices work? Spices are the parts of the plant that it doesn't want to be eaten. Plants don't like being eaten. They're fruits. They're quite happy to have their fruits eaten. They want that they're offering that up to the animals because the animals are going to eat it and then they're going to poop out the seeds somewhere else in some manure, and then the plant's going to grow somewhere else. But the rest of the plant, they don't really want to be eaten. And so these parts of the plant that we then turn into spices, they're typically loaded with lots of unpleasant tasting toxins and poisons and just chemicals that are in there to taste bad. So you try getting a peppercorn or a whole coriander seed or a cumin seed, and you chew on it, or you get some cinnamon and you chew on a bit of cinnamon bark. It doesn't taste very good.
It does not.
It does not taste very good, and that's because it's not supposed to be. The things that are in there that give it its flavour are actually quite horrible. And there's a whole raft of these different substances in there that we call flavour compounds, because the odd thing is, the strange thing is that as repulsive as these substances are, when you have them in tiny amounts, they kind of miraculously become really nice. So, for example, there is a substance called skatole, skatole, that is responsible for the smell of poop and manure. It's that horrible thing that you know when somebody's not flushed the loo. The smell of that is because it's chemical. It's horrible. It's universally hated by every living thing, maybe apart from flies. But it's horrible. But in a tiny, tiny microscopic amounts, it's got a floral, almost kind of fruity smell. And so it actually gets added to fragrances. And it has in the past been used as an additive for foods to kind of enhance the fruitiness of a food. And it could be like a yogurt or something that you'll add this to. And this is common to many of the substances that are in spices, that in small quantities they take on these kind of wondrous qualities. That could be a kind of you can have kind of woody, earthy flavors. You can have kind of citrusy flavors, and all these things. And this is what gives spices their characters. The book that I've written is about dissecting that and looking at it from a sciencey point of view of what is it that in these spices that gives them their flavor. And so, okay, that we get that. So this is what it is. And so why do certain spices go together well and others don't? Because up until now, all kind of spice cookery and cuisine has been a case of, it's like a dark art of some cookbook that's been handed down, what your mother told you, and what's been handed down through hundreds of years in many Eastern cuisines, a lot of tradition. But there is some science behind it, as why these spices and why these ingredients go together so well. And what you will find is that when you match up the qualities of the flavor compounds from two different ingredients and two different spices together, they harmonize together very well. And so you can use this science to inform, get spices that work together well. There are no hard and fast rules, other than if you add too much, it will taste bad. So it's about the balance, it's about experimenting, but it's about you understanding what the flavor compounds are in the spice and going, okay, so that's got kind of a green phenol in it that has this kind of this smell to it, and I'd like that in my dish. That's going to go quite well with my stew that I'm making. The other thing that I did was I put together, I realized that with the spices, as I was going through and finding out all the different flavor compounds in the different spices, there were kind of common themes occurring. And so some spices, they all had similar flavor compounds and had similar flavors, and so you can group them together. And I've kind of rather playfully put them into a periodic table of spices.
You did such a great job. That was one of the first things I pointed out to Pat when I cracked the book open. I thought it was brilliant.
It's such a gimmick, isn't it? Such a gimmick, the periodic table of spices. So you've kind of got a group which is predominantly, the flavor is predominated by sweet, warming substances called phenols. And they include things like cinnamon and star anise and licorice and allspice. It's interesting. Allspice is actually a spice itself. It's not a combination of spices. Did you realise that?
I think I did, but I think it's because I heard it on a podcast, actually.
Yeah. It's one of those things that everything, allspice, that's just a combination of things like nutmeg and cinnamon, isn't it? No, it's a spice itself. It was called allspice because it was considered to be the ultimate spice at one time. So
it really should be called one spice.
One spice, yes. Yes, ultimate spice. So, but for example, and the ones that are in that group, you can swap and change them because the core flavour, the thing that gives it its principal flavour, is similar. You can swap and change. So if you haven't got some anise, for example, you could swap it out with some fennel, and you will get a different flavour because they've got their own unique flavour compound mix. But it will taste similar enough that it will be compatible with whatever it is that your spice blend was that you're trying to work with originally. So that's the science behind it. But I would say that there aren't any definite no-nos. There probably are some. If you were to get some very citrusy spices and get them with some very smoky spices, I've not yet found a combination where they work together well. But it's a case of experimenting, but understanding the principles behind it and not being scared of spices.
Now, when asking someone what some sort of meat tastes like, the answer is more often than not, it tastes like chicken. Why is this?
The reason is that chicken is quite bland. There are two principal types of muscles that you have, both in us and in the meat, the flesh that we eat, and they're called fast twitch and slow twitch. Or you can kind of think of them as being the endurance muscles and the big, strong ones, like your Arnold Schwarzenegger muscles and your marathon runner, Lance Armstrong type skinny muscles. And a chicken, and when we say chicken, we're having this strange bird that we've manipulated over selective breeding for years to have huge breasts, and be completely overly proportioned, and have lots of this, what's called fast twitch muscle, principally on its breast. And those muscles there in the wild were designed for it to flap its wings. So those muscles are designed for quick, short bursts of movements, in the same way that the big muscles on your bodybuilder, they're designed for short, powerful movements. So chickens have lots of this fast twitch muscle, and the fast twitch muscle doesn't have much flavour to it. It doesn't have much of a substance called heme in it, which gives meat its meaty flavour, unlike, say, beef, which has much more of the endurance type muscles. These slow twitch muscles, they're the ones with lots of flavour in. So chicken has lots of fairly bland muscle in, so it doesn't carry a lot of flavour. It is our frame of reference. But also, interestingly, there have been some researchers who have tried to analyse the genetics or from a flavour perspective of meats. And they have concluded that many of the meats that we eat all stem from a chicken-flavoured ancestor. So when we have these things like, you say, oh, it tastes, you try a meat you've never had before. Salamander meat. It tastes like chicken. Well, there is some research apparently to show that there was an ancestor in the dim and distant past from which our chickens have come from, that is responsible for the similarity in the meats that we have. And apparently dinosaurs had the same chicken tasting ancestor. So many dinosaurs.
Wow. That's
I will
really
find
cool.
the research paper and we can put it up on the show notes, because it's really interesting, but I don't know, I can't take it too seriously.
Right.
That's awesome, Stuart. This was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your time today.
It's a pleasure. I love you guys. Great to chat with you.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
This new book is going to give you like countless things to come back and revisit us about.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited. I've become such a bore with my friends of all these things I've been reading about.
I got these friends in Canada that are actually interested in all my stories.
Yeah, no, actually, will record me talking about it. It's great.
As I understand it, we say herb, but you say herb because there's a f***ing H in it.
Yes, but let's not get pedantic about countries and spellings, because we do a lot of things in a nonsensical way.